Hi, very glad to see you on the channel. Before you start listening to the story, write in the comments whether you like the voice on the video. I don't know when exactly it started. The way Rebecca looked at me like I was something she had settled for rather than someone she had chosen. Maybe it was years ago in small, dismissive comments, or maybe it was recent in the way she barely acknowledged me anymore. But I felt it now, every day. The worst part? No one else saw it. To the world, we were a picture-perfect couple. The strong, ambitious wife and the devoted, easygoing husband. Our friends joked that we were the ideal match, her fire, my patience. But they didn't see the way she spoke to me when we were alone. They didn't hear the sharp edge in her voice when she corrected me in public, or the way she rolled her eyes when I offered an opinion. While you're here, leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that all couples had their rough patches. But then came a night at her company's gala. The night I realized my wife didn't just disrespect me, she resented me. "Jason," she had said, her voice dripping with exaggerated patience. "I don't expect you to understand business strategy, but try to keep up." Laughter. Laughter from her colleagues, from her boss, from the man standing just a little too close to her, a man whose cufflinks probably cost more than my car payment. My face burned, but I said nothing. I played my part, smiling stiffly while gripping my whiskey glass like it was the only thing keeping me from walking out. Then came the family dinner. Rebecca always insisted we host at least once a month, a tradition meant to keep our family ties strong. But in reality, it had become her stage, a place where she could remind everyone, including me, just how superior she was. "Jason," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "why don't you tell everyone about your latest job project?" She used air quotes around the last word. I swallowed. I had been freelancing after leaving a corporate job I hated, but in Rebecca's eyes, it was a step down. I had been working tirelessly, but she never saw it as enough. "I've been working with a few new clients," I said, trying to keep my tone even, building a solid foundation before expanding. Rebecca let out a small, condescending laugh. "Oh, I'm sure. But, honey, wouldn't it be better to just find a real job? I mean, this whole dream-chasing thing was cute at first, but let's be honest, it's not exactly providing much, is it?" Silence. My mother-in-law awkwardly sipped her wine. My brother shifted uncomfortably. And there I was, a grown man being scolded like a child in my own home. I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman I had once adored, the woman I had married with dreams of building a life together. And all I saw was someone who had long since stopped respecting me. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for years. Was this my life now? Was this who I had become? A man who swallowed his pride, who laughed along with the jokes at his expense, who allowed himself to be made small just to keep the peace? Or was it time to stop pretending? The answer, I realized, was obvious. I was done being silent. I woke up with a weight pressing down on my chest, a dull ache that had settled there after last night's humiliation. The laughter, the pitying glances, the way Rebecca had looked at me like I was something pitiful, something less than. It played in my mind on repeat, a slow-motion train wreck that I couldn't look away from. But today was a new day. I told myself that. I told myself I wouldn't let her get to me. I'd spent years letting her chip away at my confidence, letting her rewrite the narrative of who I was. Somewhere along the way, I had started believing it, but no more. That conviction carried me through the morning. I worked from my home office, forcing myself to focus, drowning out every creeping thought of Rebecca. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I was overreacting, that maybe I had read too much into it. That was until the dinner party. Rebecca had arranged it a week ago, one of her networking events disguised as a casual gathering. I didn't want to go. The last thing I needed was another night of subtle jabs and fake smiles. But I went because that's what I always did. The house belonged to one of her friends from work, a sleek, modern place with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that screamed money. The kind of place Rebecca always told me we should be living in by now. The kind of place I used to think we'd get together, until she stopped thinking of us as a team. The wine flowed freely. the room filled with the hum of conversations I had no interest in. I stayed by the bar, nursing a drink and pretending to listen while Rebecca worked the room like she was running for office. She had a way of making people feel like they were the most important person in the world when she wanted to. And then it happened. So, Jason, a voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to see Daniel, one of Rebecca's colleagues, a man with a polished smile and a watch that cost more than my rent. How's business going? Still working on that little side gig? I stiffened. That little side gig. The words were casual, said with the kind of offhand amusement that made it clear where he had heard it from. I forced a smile. It's going well, actually. Really? Rebecca's voice cut in, smooth and saccharine. She rested a hand on Daniel's arm, her engagement ring catching the light. Jason has been so passionate about his work. It's admirable, really. Not everyone would have the patience to keep it something with so little reward. A few people chuckled. My grip tightened around my glass. I mean, she continued, laughing lightly, he's practically a house husband at this point. I don't mind, of course. It's kind of cute, like a modern reversal of roles. That did it. I set my glass down. The room had gone silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see if I would do what I always did. Laugh it off, smile, let her win. Not tonight. I turned to face her fully, my voice calm but firm. You know what, Rebecca? You're right. It is admirable. I stepped closer, keeping my gaze locked on hers. It's admirable that I've built something from the ground up, instead of leeching off someone else's success. Her smile faltered. Daniel cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. I wasn't done. It's admirable that I've chosen a path that makes me happy, rather than clinging to some shallow, materialistic idea of success just to impress people who don't actually matter. Rebecca's face darkened. Jason, don't be ridiculous. No, let's talk about it. My voice rose slightly, enough that the conversations around us completely died. Let's talk about how you love making me the punchline in front of your friends. Let's talk about how you constantly belittle what I do, just because it doesn't fit your idea of worthy work. Or better yet, I stepped even closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. Let's talk about how you've been pushing me down for years, hoping I'd stay there, so you wouldn't have to look at your own reflection and see how empty you've become. Her mouth parted slightly. A flicker of something flashed in her eyes. Anger, shock, something else. Excuse me, she hissed, trying to grab my arm, but I stepped back. I turned away from her, scanning the room. Enjoy the rest of the evening, everyone. Then I grabbed my coat and walked out. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I welcomed it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel powerless. I felt alive. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning. I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly for a while, the city lights blurring past, my hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My heart was still pounding, adrenaline coursing through me from what had just happened. I had never done that before. Never humiliated Rebecca like she had humiliated me. Never fought back. And yet, even now, a small part of me wondered if I had made a mistake. If I had just made things worse. I pulled into a quiet parking lot, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle around me. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. I already knew who it was. Rebecca wouldn't call. Not yet. She'd let me stew, let her anger build, wait for the perfect moment to strike back. But I knew the messages would come from her friends, from Daniel, maybe even from her mother, all playing the same tune. What was that about? Are you okay? Translation: you embarrassed Rebecca. Fix it. I sighed, leaning my head back against the seat. For the first time, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for months, maybe years. Did I even love her anymore? Or had I been clinging to the ghost of the woman I had once loved, hoping she would come back? I thought about the early years, when we were young and broke, but happy, when she used to look at me like I was enough. When had that changed? When had I changed? I didn't know how long I sat there before I finally started the car again and headed home. I expected the house to be dark, Rebecca already asleep or pretending to be. But when I stepped inside, the living room light was on, and she was waiting. Arms crossed, back straight, her expression unreadable. "You're late," she said. I tossed my keys on the counter, not bothering to take off my coat. Didn't realize I had a curfew. Don't do that, she snapped. Don't act like you didn't just humiliate me in front of my colleagues. You mean the same way you humiliate me every time we're in public? I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. What? You don't like how that feels? Her jaw tightened. That was different. How? Because I don't. She cut herself off, exhaling sharply. I don't do it to hurt you. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. No, you just do it because it makes you feel powerful. Because it makes you look good in front of your friends. I shook my head, running a hand through my hair. Tell me, Rebecca, do you even respect me anymore? Or am I just something convenient to have around? She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything. I turned to leave, heading for the bedroom, but her voice stopped me. Are you cheating on me? I froze. Slowly, I turned back to her, frowning. What? She stared at me, eyes narrowed, lips pressed together like she was trying to hold something back. It would explain a lot, she continued. The distance, the attitude. Tonight, I let out a short laugh, shaking my head in disbelief. Are you serious? Why is that funny? She snapped. Meant like you don't just grow a backbone overnight. You don't just wake up one day and decide to humiliate your wife unless something or someone is pushing you to do it. Men like me, I repeated, my voice quieter now. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She hesitated. I mean, no, say it. I took a step closer. Say what you really mean, Rebecca. Her mouth opened, then closed again. And for the first time, I saw something flicker across her face. Not anger, not smugness, guilt. Something was wrong. I took another step forward, watching her carefully. You've been distant too, I said slowly. Long before tonight. Always on your phone. Always working late. Always finding ways to make me feel small. I tilted my head, studying her. Almost like you needed an excuse. Like you needed a reason to make me the bad guy. She looked away. Don't be ridiculous. I exhaled, shaking my head. I'm not the one being ridiculous, Rebecca. I'm just finally seeing things clearly. I didn't wait for her response. I walked past her, down the hallway, and into the bedroom, closing the door behind me. My pulse was racing. My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was from anger or something else. Dread. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, my mind replaying every moment of the last few months. The late nights. The way she'd been dressing up more, even on days she didn't have meetings. The way she suddenly seemed so unimpressed with me, like I'd already lost, and she was just waiting for me to figure out. I wasn't the one cheating. She was. I felt sick. I needed proof. I wasn't going to accuse her outright. Not without something solid. That's what she would want, an emotional outburst, something she could twist and use against me. No, I needed to be smart. I needed to know. I pushed myself off the bed and started moving, searching. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first. A message on her laptop? A receipt? But then, in the back of our closet, tucked behind old shoeboxes and things she hadn't touched in years, I found it. A small, elegant box. My fingers hesitated before opening it. And when I did, my stomach dropped. Inside was an expensive gold watch. Not mine. Not something I had ever seen before. And next to it, a card. I can't wait for our next weekend together. You deserve so much more than him. Soon. Yours. No name. I closed the box slowly, my hands trembling. Rebecca wasn't just cheating. She was planning something. And suddenly, I wasn't sure if I had ever really known my wife at all. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, the small box resting on the nightstand beside me, its presence taunting me. The weight of what I'd found pressed down on my chest, tightening like a vice. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to wake Rebecca up and shove the evidence in her face. But I didn't. I couldn't. That would give her control. That would give her the chance to twist things, to manipulate, to paint me as the irrational husband lashing out. No, I needed something solid. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. There was no doubt now. Rebecca was having an affair. But with who? And more importantly, why had she been working so hard to undermine me? I picked up the card again, running my thumb over the embossed lettering. Soon. What did that mean? Was she waiting for something? The thought made my stomach churn. I had to be smart about this. I couldn't afford to let my emotions take over. If I confronted her now, she'd lie. She'd gaslight. She'd make it seem like I was the one being paranoid. I needed undeniable proof, something she couldn't talk her way out of. I left the bedroom quietly, moving through the house with deliberate steps. Rebecca was still asleep, her even breathing carrying down the hall. I slipped into her home office, shutting the door behind me. I had never been the type to snoop, but tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't a husband. I was a man hunting for the truth. I sat at her desk and turned on her laptop. The screen flickered to life, asking for a password. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I tried the usual ones: our anniversary, her mother's name, her childhood pet. Nothing. Then I thought back to the way she had changed, the way she had been pulling away. I typed in "Jason is pathetic." The screen unlocked. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Her emails were open, neatly categorized into folders, color-coded like she did with everything in her life. I scanned through them, my eyes darting over work correspondence, shopping receipts, invitations. Then I found it, a folder labeled personal. I clicked. Dozens of emails, some from people I recognized, friends, family, but others were marked with only initials. My heart pounded as I opened the most recent one. "Missed you today. Can't wait for our trip. Just a few more weeks, and it'll all be behind us. He doesn't deserve you. You deserve everything. Yours, G." I clenched my jaw, reading it over again. Trip? A few more weeks? My mind raced, piecing together fragments of conversations. The way she had been so dismissive lately. The way she had treated me like I was already a ghost in her life. She was planning to leave me. And she wasn't just planning to leave. She was making sure I looked like the bad guy in the process. That's why she had been chipping away at me for months, turning every little thing I did into proof that I was weak, unsuccessful, not worthy of her. She wanted to rewrite the narrative. Jason was a failure. Jason was holding her back. Jason wasn't enough. And when she left, no one would question it. They would nod in understanding, pitying her for staying as long as she had. I closed the laptop, breathing heavily through my nose. I wanted to break something. I wanted to storm into that bedroom and wake her up and demand to know how long she had been plotting this. But I held back. Not yet. I had leverage now. I knew she was leaving, but what I didn't know was how she planned to do it. A divorce? A sudden disappearance? Was she taking money from our accounts? Would she leave me drowning in debt while she rode off into the sunset with G? I needed to be sure. I needed to trap her in her own game before she had the chance to execute it. I pulled out my phone and did what I never thought I would do. I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was easy, a simple app connected to an extra device I placed under her dashboard. She wouldn't notice. She never paid attention to that kind of thing. I also set up a monitoring system for our joint accounts, tracking any large transfers or hidden withdrawals. Then, as an extra layer, I placed a small recording device in her office. Rebecca thought she was smart, but I was about to prove that I was smarter. The next morning, I played my part perfectly. I didn't let on that I knew anything. I kissed her cheek before she left for work, watched as she smiled, oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to collapse. I went about my day, as usual, working from home, drinking my coffee, nodding along to her routine check-in call. She was good at pretending, but now I was better. That evening, I watched the GPS tracker from my phone as she stayed late at the office. Except she wasn't at her office. She was across town, parked outside a high-end hotel. I waited. An hour passed. Then two. Finally, she left, stepping out of the hotel in a sleek black dress, her hair perfect, her lips painted that deep red she used to wear when she wanted to impress me. But she wasn't alone. A man followed her. Older, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that screamed power. He placed a hand on her lower back as they walked toward his car, laughing at something she said. And suddenly, I knew who G was. My uncle. I gripped my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Rebecca wasn't just cheating. She was sleeping with my uncle. The same man who had been like a father to me after my parents passed. The same man who had mentored me, who had always told me I was meant for something greater. The same man who had promised that one day his fortune would be passed down to me. Now it all made sense. Rebecca wasn't just leaving me. She was trying to secure something. A future. A fortune. I sat back, my mind racing. She thought she had won. She thought she had played the perfect game. But she had underestimated me. And when I was done, she wouldn't just lose. She would have nothing. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. Laughing. Touching him. Whispering things she once whispered to me. My uncle. The man who had been a second father to me. The man who had always treated me like his own son. And Rebecca, my wife, the woman who had once looked at me like I was her world. How long had they been planning this? How long had she been waiting for the perfect moment to destroy me? I stared at the ceiling until the early hours of the morning, my mind racing, my body buzzing with a toxic mix of anger and something else, something sharper. A dark, quiet satisfaction, because now I knew, and knowledge was power. Rebecca thought she had outplayed me. She thought she had set everything up perfectly, that she would leave me ruined and walk away with a future secured by a man who had far more money than I ever would. But she had underestimated me. She thought I would be weak, that I would crumble under the weight of her betrayal, that I would give up and fade into the background like an afterthought. She was wrong. When morning came, I moved through the house like nothing had changed. I greeted her with a casual, "Good morning," kissed her cheek just as I always did. I watched as she poured her coffee, scrolling through her phone, pretending like she wasn't lying to my face every single second she breathed. "I've had a long day today," she said, not looking up. "Meetings back to back." "Sounds exhausting," I said, sipping my own coffee. "Need me to pick up dinner?" She smiled, that fake, practice smile that used to fool me. That would be great. She had no idea I knew she was meeting him tonight. Again, I watched her leave, still playing the devoted husband, still keeping up the charade. But the second that door closed behind her, I got to work. First, I called my lawyer. I didn't want just any lawyer. I wanted the best. A man who specialized in cases like this, who could take Rebecca's entire plan and tear it apart piece by piece. The prenup we had signed years ago was my golden ticket. At the time, she had signed it without a second thought, convinced that I was the one benefiting from it, convinced that I would always be the one making more money. But now ensured she walked away with nothing. Not a dime, not the house, not even a car she loved so much. I went through our accounts, checking every detail. She hadn't made any major withdrawals yet, but knew it was only a matter of time. She was waiting for the right moment. I wasn't going to give her that moment. Then I focused on the next step, gathering undeniable proof. The hotel receipts, the messages, the GPS records. I compiled everything, making sure there was no possible way for her to talk her way out of it. And then, just for good measure, I made sure to set up a meeting with my uncle. He had no idea I was coming. When I arrived at his office, his secretary barely spared me a glance before waving me through. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, scrolling through emails, a glass of whiskey already in his hand, even though it wasn't even noon yet. He looked up, surprised, but his expression quickly smoothed over. "Jason," he said, standing, "didn't expect you." I closed the door behind me and took a seat across from him, my heart pounding. Not with fear, not with nerves, but with cold, calculated purpose. "How long?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. He blinked. "What?" I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" To his credit, he didn't react right away. But I saw it. The flicker of something in his eyes. The tightening of his grip on his glass. He let out a slow breath, setting the glass down carefully. "Jason, I think you need to... Don't lie to me." I cut in. "Not now. Not when I already know everything." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's not what you think." I laughed, shaking my head. "It never is it?" "She came to me," he said quickly, leaning forward. "Months ago. She told me you were struggling, that you were lost, that she didn't know how to help you anymore." I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep my expression neutral. "She said she needed stability," he continued, "that she needed someone who could give her the life she deserved. And that someone was you?" I asked, my voice dripping with amusement. How noble. He had the decency to look guilty, but not guilty enough. "I planned to tell you," he said. Before you rewrote your will?" I interrupted. His eyes snapped to mine, startled. Yeah, I knew. Rebecca had been playing the long game. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about securing a future, about replacing me entirely. And my uncle, whether he had realized it or not, was a pawn in her plan. I stood slowly, smoothing out my shirt. Well, I said, I appreciate your honesty. He frowned, watching me carefully. That's it. I smiled. That's it. I left his office without another word, my mind already working through the final steps. That night, I sat at home waiting. Rebecca strolled in hours later, looking effortlessly composed, her makeup still flawless, her dress barely wrinkled. She looked at me and smiled like nothing had changed. How was your day? She asked. I smiled back. Productive. I watched as she walked into the bedroom, completely unaware that her world was about to shatter. She thought she had won. She thought she had played the perfect hand. She had no idea I was about to take everything from her. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee as Rebecca moved around the house, oblivious to the noose tightening around her neck. She hummed softly to herself, checking her phone, probably reading another message from my uncle. I wondered if she ever felt guilty, if there was even a moment of hesitation before she sent him those messages, if she ever looked at me and thought, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. I doubted it. She had been playing a long game, carefully setting the stage, making sure that when she finally left, she would be the victim, the wife of an unsuccessful man, a woman who had tried everything to support her husband, only to be let down time and time again. That was the story she had been crafting, and I had let her believe it was working. She glanced at me as she grabbed her purse. I have dinner plans with the girls tonight, she said casually. I smiled. Sound fun? She hesitated for half a second, but then she nodded and walked out the door. As soon as she was gone, I pulled out my phone. The GPS tracker showed her car moving across town. Not toward any restaurant, but straight to my uncle's mansion. Right on time. I already had everything I needed. The financial records, the messages, the proof of the affair. Now, all that was left was the final act. I drove across town, my hands steady on the wheel, my heart pounding with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. I arrived at the mansion just as the sun was setting, parking in a spot where I could see everything without being noticed. Sure enough, there she was, stepping out of her car, fixing her hair, checking her reflection in the window before making her way inside. I gave an hour. Then I walked right up to the front door and knocked. The housekeeper answered, her eyes widening slightly when she saw me. I'm here to see my wife, I said. She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. Mr. Jason, I don't think. I stepped past her before she could stop me. Rebecca and my uncle were in the dining room, sitting far too close, whispering, sipping wine like they were in some private fantasy. The moment they saw me, Rebecca's face drained of color. My uncle tensed, gripping his glass like he had been caught stealing. I smiled. Hope I'm not interrupting. Rebecca recovered quickly, straightening her back, forcing a scowl onto her face. What are you doing here? I pulled out my phone and tossed it onto the table in front of them. The screen was still open to their messages, every detail of their affair laid out in perfect clarity. Just thought we should have an honest conversation. My uncle sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Jason, let's not do this. Not do what? I leaned forward. Not talk about how you've been screwing my wife behind my back. Not talk about how she's been waiting for you to rewrite your will so she can cash out. I turned to Rebecca. Was that the plan? Wait until he put your name in ink, then cut me loose? Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're being ridiculous. I let out a short laugh. No, what's ridiculous is that you actually thought you could outsmart me. My uncle stood up, trying to regain control of the situation. Jason, I never meant for this to happen. I shook my head. I don't care what you meant, but I do care about what's going to happen next. I turned to Rebecca and slid a manila envelope across the table. That's the paperwork. You're signing it tonight. Her fingers hesitated before she picked it up, her eyes scanning the front page. Her lips parted slightly as the realization sank in. You're divorcing me? She whispered. I tilted my head. Of course. What did you think was going to happen? She looked at me, her eyes darting between me and my uncle like she had just realized she wasn't in control anymore. And before you even think about trying to fight this, I continued, let me remind you about the prenup you signed. You remember that, don't you? The one that ensures you leave with absolutely nothing. Her hands clenched into fists. I smiled. Sign it, Rebecca, or drag this out, and I promise you, when I'm done, you won't even have your reputation left. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. She had thought she was the predator. She had forgotten that sometimes the prey fights back. Rebecca stared at the divorce papers like they were a foreign language, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges of the envelope. I could see the gears turning in her head, desperately trying to calculate a way out. But there wasn't one. She had played her game well, but she had underestimated me. She thought I would break, that I would lash out in anger and give her the leverage she needed to turn this around. Instead, I had stayed quiet. I had gathered proof. And now, I was the one dictating the terms. You're being cruel, she said, her voice low, calculated, but I could hear the faint tremor underneath it. After everything we've been through, you're just throwing it all away? I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. That's rich, coming from you. I'm throwing it away? Rebecca, you set this marriage on fire and danced in the ashes. Don't pretend you care now. Her jaw clenched. You don't understand? I understand perfectly. I leaned forward, my voice sharp but controlled. You want it out. You just want to make sure you left with something. You spent months breaking me down, making me look like a failure, so no one would question why you were leaving. You wanted my uncle's money, his lifestyle, his name. But there was just one little problem. I smiled coldly. You got caught. She swallowed, her eyes darting to my uncle, but he was staring down at his drink, silent. He wasn't going to save her. Not tonight. Not ever. He knew he had been played too. Rebecca's fingers tightened around the papers. This isn't fair. Fair. I laughed again, but there was no humor in it. You're walking away with exactly what you brought into this marriage. That's what's fair. She shook her head, her breathing uneven now. I won't sign. I nodded, as if I had expected this. That's fine. We can take this to court. But when we do, every single piece of evidence I've gathered is going public. The messages, the hotel receipts, the financial records. You'll be dragged through the mud. And when it's over, you'll still walk away with nothing. Only difference is you'll be humiliated in the process. I'll let that sink in. She stared at me, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She was realizing, maybe for the first time, that she had lost. Slowly, she lowered her gaze to the papers. She flipped through them, her eyes scanning the terms. No alimony, no assets, just a clean break. A void where her carefully crafted future had once been. My uncle finally spoke, his voice heavy. Rebecca, just sign. Her head snapped toward him, eyes wide with betrayal. You knew about the prenup. You knew I would get nothing, and you let me. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I made a mistake. His voice was flat. Hollow. I see that now. Her expression twisted into something ugly. Desperate. You promised me, I promised you nothing, he said, cutting her off. You assumed. She let out a sharp breath, her nails digging into the table. For a moment, I thought she might actually try to fight. But then, she saw the truth in my eyes. There was no escaping this. She picked up the pen with unsteady fingers and signed. The finality of it settled over the room like a heavy fog. I took the papers, folded them neatly, and tucked them back into the envelope. It was done. I stood, sliding my chair back with a quiet scrape against the polished floor. I'll have my lawyer send you the finalized documents. Rebecca didn't look at me. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her breathing shallow. I turned to my uncle. And you? I asked. Still planning to rewrite that will? His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew the answer. I smiled. Good luck with that. And then I walked out, leaving them both behind, trapped in the mess they had created. Rebecca thought she had one. She thought she had outmaneuvered me. But now she had nothing. And me? I had my freedom. Thank you for listening to the end. I hope you enjoyed it very much. Don't forget to give a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in such a situation.